modeling seems to be taking off as an industry in response to this spike in natural disasters. And so if we can use Puerto Rico as a case study and kind of go over some of the major damages that we saw from this hurricane, which pretty much you can repeat the same story in just about every hurricane in the world. So if you can first explain what your AI machine learning modeling is all about, and then let's see if we can apply it to the various power and road and other infrastructure and social damages that we saw here.
Well, the two things that we currently have that are working as modeling products are for seismic and for flood. And I think for Puerto Rico, knowing, I don't think people from the mainland really understand how mountainous Puerto Rico is and how heavy rainfall events, even from a weak tropical system, can cause devastation across the island. So one of the things that we're about to do in Puerto Rico as we start doing the permanent work to build back is to look at what are we going to do to mitigate the flood risk. And so what we can do with the AI is we can look at what are you proposing to do, like putting in bigger culverts or if you're going to elevate this road. Well, let's now model it and run it under the simulation of how much rain you got in Maria or other high rainfall events and look at how it performs. But not just look at that project, look at all the projects being proposed and see how they complement or perhaps don't complement each other. We're going to have so much work to do in Puerto Rico, and we're not going to have enough funds to do everything. But what we can do now is we can start modeling what are the most vulnerable areas to heavy rainfall events. What's the best mitigation for that? In some cases, it may be buyouts. In other cases, it may be elevations. But in many areas, it's going to be how can we apply both natural as well as man-made mitigation projects to reduce future flood events. And before we really got into this, you really looked at mitigation project by project. You couldn't really look at the total of impacts. And you couldn't look at various scenarios of different rainfall events. And so knowing that flooding has historically been one of the chief risks that Puerto Rico faces in tropical systems, even weak storms, we're really focused on how can we predict better what kind of impacts that rain's going to have when the forecast is there. But more importantly, how we can look at the things we can do to reduce that risk before the next storm happens and actually model out if we had a 20-inch rainfall event, how would this project perform? If we had a 30-inch rainfall event, how would this project perform? And then look at that project in combination with other projects and go, are we getting the best return on our investment looking collectively at mitigation and building that resiliency? Are we hoping that a bunch of projects add up to that?
Okay, now, which means that when you look at future risks, right, when you project forward what is likely to happen or what might happen, so instead of looking at past experience with natural disasters, when we look at future and we can project an increase in intensity and frequency of these sort of natural disasters, again, we're using Puerto Rico as a case study here, looking at this particular incident, but this pretty much applies just about everywhere. So your system is able to provide that kind of scenario thinking and then identify the highest risk properties that the government and the private sector might address or prepare for, so that in the case of a flood event or a storm or any other kind of disaster, a fire, a drought, etc., they are ready or readier to jump on those high vulnerability sites, neighborhoods, properties because of that modeling. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, that's the way it works. And it also helps us pick up the most vulnerable areas so we know which areas will flood and how bad it will be before the event ever occurs. And then when the storm is actually threatening, days out, we can actually run the model and really give high resolution of who needs to evacuate. But one of the other things that we're also very excited about is building climate into the AI process and using machine learning to take these very open-ended climate models that say you can look at feet, inches to feet and increase in sea level rise. You can look at increased risk of rainfall events. Well, we have to translate that into what are you building against? And now starting to couple the climate models with these tools to actually give local officials a better idea of what's their resiliency score, what areas are the best investments to build resiliency. Not every project is going to give us the same return. And since we don't have unlimited funds, we're going to have to be really targeted on what we do invest in and look at from the standpoint of the entire community. Are these projects really increasing our resiliency score in the face of climate disruptions? And particularly with flooding, are these projects really getting us past, I think the current thinking of was always look at past weather events to plan for the future and really use those future risk models to say, are we doing enough work here that we're going to be resilient, not just for another Maria, but what if it's a Harvey and dumps 50 inches of rain on Puerto Rico? We're not going to be able to stop every disaster, but we can at least identify those things that we cannot live without. Hospitals, generator stations, transformer stations, things that we don't want to get taken out in the worst case flood scenarios because it's too devastating to try to even begin a response for that. So we won't be able to move everything. But what are the things we should be focused on and using AI and machine learning to help bring that to the surface versus kind of looking at the whole island and go, where do we even start?
Okay, yeah, that's fantastic. So in the case of Puerto Rico, let's say looking forward, if you were to come here and meet with the authorities and the responsible parties, you would look at our power plants and see, okay, Maria, we lost so many generation plants and transmission lines and neighborhood distribution lines, and then you look at the hospitals that you mentioned, some of the key government facilities, and in fact, some of the private sector large employment centers that were knocked out and now are leading to massive migration back to the States. So vulnerable neighborhoods and that were even more flooded, and we had a lot of vulnerable communities there. So in other words, you would come into a situation like this and you would say, okay, these are the hot spots, these are the vulnerable points, power stations, schools, hospitals, etc. And what would you put together and present to the government? Or who would you present it to? Would it be the government? Would it be a coalition of government and private sector, since these facilities, a lot of them are privately owned? I mean, walk us through the mechanics of how your visit and your work would look like in order to make that place a more resilient jurisdiction going forward.
Well, we work with just about anybody. If you look at the recovery in Puerto Rico, the primary funding is going to be the FEMA mitigation dollars and your community block grant dollars that are coming from HUD. So this will be one-time money that Puerto Rico will have to invest in building resiliency. We've been talking with government officials. We've been talking with local officials. We'd love to talk to businesses. But I think one of the things that we would propose is let us come in and let's build the model for the state or for the territory, run the simulations and start identifying by sector where these key areas is. I think one of the things I would focus on, I know a lot of people are focused on power, but I think the bigger challenge for Puerto Rico was the road system. Yes. That even with the power out, you couldn't even get to fixed power lines, much less get supplies to a lot of communities. So I would look at, what are the kind of backbone infrastructures that are the highest priority that are required for the Commonwealth. And I would look at things like, what's my road network and how vulnerable is it? And we did a lot of emergency work. But now that we start looking at permanent work, where should we put in bridges? Where should we put in larger culverts? Where should we reroute highways so that they stay open in these flood events? Because once the roads were gone, it became just about impossible to move anything out of San Juan to the interior or across the island. And it took a lot of helicopters, and in many cases, villages and communities weren't reached for days to weeks. And when you start talking about, trying to rebuild the power grid, well, the first thing you got to do is rebuild a road to even get trucks in there to work on the power line. You can imagine how that just slows everything down. And the idea of being resilient isn't that you won't have damages, is that the damages are repairable. You can get them back up relatively quickly, and they don't disrupt the economy. They don't disrupt the populations. So what we would do is look at, okay, if you want to look at hospitals, well, again, hospitals depend upon water, power, and transportation. If we're talking about communication systems, well, they got to be able to get to those cell sites and get generators there. If you're talking about the power grid, where are the places that got washed out? I mean, there was a lot of wind damage, but the biggest problem was you couldn't even get to those areas because the road networks were down. If you bring stuff and you have it sitting in the port, but you don't have drivers because they can't get in to get to their trucks, and then they can't even get out of the city because there's just no way to get to the interior. Those are the kind of things we can model. And then as you're looking at your mitigation projects, going, where should we make our investment? Should it just be hardening the grid? Should it be improving our road networks? Should it be making the hospitals more resilient by allowing them to have more emergency capabilities, generators, fuel, on-site water supplies, so when they do get cut off, they can still function for that local community? But these are the kind of questions that we can ask and run these simulations very quick, like 15 minutes or less, and run multiple scenarios versus having to do all this work per project or by model at one event. We can do multiple events, we can look at multiple options, and then we can do the what ifs. If we did this, what changes? And we can do that before you start spending sums of money on projects that may or may not be our best investments, with the goal of, let's build a more resilient infrastructure so that when the next hurricane occurs, the next flood occurs, yes, there'll be damages, but Puerto Rico will be in a better position to respond to it and recover much quicker at much lower cost, but more importantly, much lower impacts to the citizens.
Fantastic. Now, I'd like to address the coastal challenge, both in terms of sea level rise and flooding from storm surges that are becoming more serious because of sea level rise. And I was part of an initiative here last year before Maria, where we huddled with some top scientists on the island and looked at sea level. Sea level, the projections are horrific, as we all know, and it's going to happen relatively soon, before the end of the century. And so the scenario modeling thinking in terms of sea level rise and the connection with storm surges, what can we do now, even before, not just the next hurricane, but just looking ahead the next several decades of hurricanes and just sea level rise and, just its own damage, regardless of occasional storms, to prepare, to identify those vulnerable communities, those vulnerable properties, and to really be able to recommend an affordable plan to deal with that.
I think, again,
relocating key facilities. Our power plants are on the coast. So many of our hospitals are near the coasts. Of course, the residential and the commercial construction that's on the coast, and the vulnerable communities on the coasts. And again, that applies to Puerto Rico. It applies to every island and every coastal community. You are in Florida. You directed emergency management in Florida before you joined FEMA, or before you became the director of FEMA. And so you have a lot of experience in terms of dealing with coastal zones. But projecting to a sea level, even a catastrophic sea level rise, what would you do, or what can vulnerable places do right now to prepare and model for that?
Well, we already have projections from NOAA on what we can see in various ranges, both short-term and long-term for sea level rise. I think in the short term, we're already seeing impacts here in the Atlantic coast area, Norfolk, Miami Beach, other places. They're already seeing increased flooding from king tides and sunny day flooding events when the wind shifts the wrong way. So we're already seeing those kind of effects. One of the things that we were looking at one concern was, can we give local decision makers and the states and territories better tools to look at what areas could you harden and is within the lifespan of that would be able to manage the sea level rise, and where should we start looking to move? The other thing is when we're rebuilding, don't just build it back to the minimum standards. We either need to move it or elevate it higher. And not every part of the coast has the same impacts, and particularly for storm surge in Puerto Rico, the bays and harbors are the ones that get the biggest storm surge. So as we look at these areas, we already know what our risk is from the hurricanes. You add in now the sea level rise forecast, and now you got to start making decisions. Is this something that, if it's new construction, can we move it away from that most vulnerable area so that within its 100-year lifespan or whatever that is, it's not going to be overtaken by sea level rise. Those things that are already in the areas that may be overtaken by sea level rise, how do we start planning on moving it? And generally, it's a very expensive and difficult decision. And for people's homes, it's almost impossible to get people to move before the impacts. But after something happens, let's make sure we have the plan in place where we're not going to build it back where it was, but we know where we're going to build it when we have that opportunity. And so if we can just stop adding to the construction in these high-risk areas and then begin a strategic plan. Some people call it strategic retreat. I don't like the term retreat, but I think it's managing our risk by moving inland so that we maximize the resiliency of the new construction, minimize the disruptions. But when you look at sea level rise combined with the storm surge events, we're already seeing that areas that are getting routine flooding, if a storm comes in on one of those high tides, it's going to be even worse than what some of the models say. And the other thing for Puerto Rico that is less of a problem on the Atlantic East Coast, but for Puerto Rico, still one of the major considerations there is the risk of earthquakes and tsunamis. So you need to factor in the geological, which doesn't have anything to do with climate change, but think about the things where if we do things to mitigate for climate and sea level rise, we'll actually harden and build more resilience for the tsunami risk as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Now you made reference there to the resistance by homeowners and of course others and property owners in general to move before the impact. It applies both to sea level rise as well as to just the frequency and the intensity of storm surges and just storms going forward. But that brings up another question in terms of what are you seeing on as a reaction or response from authorities and the players in a place that need to not just bring you in, but do the modeling, do the scenario thinking, do the planning. Is this is there top of mind awareness in these authorities? Is there the sort of consciousness or awareness that we need for them to have for them to do this and actually see the value, see the return on investment, make the investment, look for the money? What are you seeing in terms of that kind of decision-making infrastructure in cities, including Puerto Rico? The contact that you've had so far, your experience with our leaders over the years, but really more broadly, the political and kind of business environment in a place that will make them responsive to this message. Is it happening? Is it too slow? Is it frustrating for you guys when you sit in the office and you say, wow, why can't they get it? Why can't they see it? Yeah. And what does it take?
Well, I think it is frustrating. One concern, we're focused on saving lives. And much of what we're proposing or looking at is how do we reduce the death tolls from these disasters, both by doing a lot of work on the front end to help people be better prepared, build their teams, but also mitigate and build resiliency. And then when the event occurs, I mean, look at one of the challenges we had in Puerto Rico. We weren't even sure where to start doing search and rescue. A lot of it just started because we were flying over and people were waving to us, or we got to the people you could get to. One of the things we want to be able to do is provide a tool so that when Puerto Rico has this kind of floods, you can map out very quickly from the rainfall and look at the areas that are likely to have the greatest impacts to prioritize your search and rescue team. Because too often, you heard this story time and time again, people were weeks before they ever had the first outside contact. Well, did we get to the people that were in the greatest need first, the people that needed rescuing? And so it's really about changing outcomes. And we can do a lot by building resiliency, but during an event, we want to make sure we're prioritizing. So for us, it's frustrating knowing that we have these new tools. We are brand new, just getting out there. Our seismic products have already in place in several cities up along the West Coast where they have a lot of earthquake risk. We're starting to get some interest in and working on getting our flood products out there. But I think it's still this tradition of we're very reactive. We wait till something happens. We don't think, or we're not really sure how AI can change this. And when I was at FEMA, our primary tool for modeling disasters was HAZs. But that's 1990 technology. It has no of the capabilities that we currently have. And again, one of the big challenges with a lot of these models, they take too long to run. They're cumbersome. They don't give you high resolution. They're not the tool we need today. And by using what we call benevolent AI and machine learning, we can take and ingest and process so much information so much faster that we can give decision makers such high resolution information on what the impacts are when an event's about to occur, but also use that same tool to train their teams, exercise their teams, build their scenarios, look at their vulnerabilities, and then hopefully direct their resiliency goals and mitigation projects by what things can we do to give us the greatest reduction in future impacts. And that isn't always going to be the project that may be promoted by somebody who say, hey, I got this idea, let's go do this. We can actually model it and go, well, it's not a bad idea, but given the amount of money we invested at the time, it probably doesn't do as much good if we did something else. And not having the ability to really touch each of these projects that way and show how it would change the impacts and go, if I'm the decision maker and I have X amount of money to spend on these projects, am I spending them on the projects to give us the best return and reduces risk? And also, are we factoring in our societal vulnerabilities? I mean, it's very easy for those that are well off, affluent, and have a lot of representation with the government to get a lot of assistance. But what about the unrepresented communities or underrepresented communities? Can we make sure we're not neglecting them? And that's one of the things with AI. We can actually build that in there and go, hey, you know, areas that are low income or impoverished get hit harder and have more impacts in these floods. Maybe we should be looking at those areas versus some of the more affluent areas, which actually can manage their risk a little bit better, have higher insurance. And these areas here, same impacts would be devastating to these families.
Yeah. It does come back to the future risk concept, no? I mean, in terms of getting people in government, in the private sector, even community leaders to understand that future risk, meaning that future risk is going to be, it's worse than the previous, that one we've lived so far.
Yeah.
We have to kind of open up our minds to this new reality of climate change, to this new higher intensity, higher frequency of storms, of sea level rise, and the other complications, and kind of like, you know, become aware and then open our minds to having this conversation, to doing the modeling, the scenarios, and making things happen. So it's almost like a psychological, sociological challenge at this point, given that the awareness of the temperature rise and the science worsening is so recent. It's understandable that people are not quite there yet, but it becomes a serious challenge, you know, to get people there mentally and emotionally as soon as possible, so then they will embrace the conversation with you and do the modeling and do the scenarios and make it work, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, when Hurricane Sandy made landfall, you know, President Obama, we were getting ready to go up to New Jersey to see the damage, meet with Governor Christie, and President Obama is talking to me. He says, you know, Craig, the debate about climate change is over. I really think we should be focused on adapting. And that was back in, before the second term. And so we started really thinking differently about how come we always use the last 100 years worth of weather data to figure out what the future is going to look like when the future is changing so fast that these events are occurring so frequently, you've lost the meaning of a 100-year event. And that really started this process of me trying to think of how do we look at the future so we don't have any data. And that's why when One Concern approached me, I was like blown away, because for the first time, we were now looking at not just what has happened in the past, but what can happen. And being able to show local decision makers, hey, this is what the flood looks like. And let's take Maria. Maria is not as bad as it could be from the rainfall. A slower moving storm would have been much worse. But it's hard to get people's attention, because you're just saying, what will be worse? Well, what do you mean by worse? Well, let's show you. Let's run it at a high resolution where pick a place in the Commonwealth, pick a town. And let's show you what it looks like if we get this rainfall event. And being able to do that what if, but show people, all right, this is how your hospitals did. Here's how your road system did. This is what your water treatment plant did. This is how many homes flooded. And we're doing that right now for Texas. We're looking at Harvey, and we're running those various scenarios, and we're looking at, with the information we had, we could have made better decisions about ordering evacuations of very targeted areas versus the entire city of Houston evacuating, and reduce the impacts of those, the life-threatening part of the storm. We know that if we do certain projects, we can actually improve and build more resiliency from future flood risk. But it's that ability to show people a map and show them, okay, here's what can happen. If we're seeing a 10 to 15% increase in rainfall induced damages from climate change and tropical systems, well, what does that look like if we bumped up Maria 15, 20%? And then show how that looked, and going, well, if you're rebuilding or you're building back to Maria, you still may not be building back to what the future risk will be. So being able to take and couple these climate models with the flood models, and then show decision makers, if you made the following decisions, this is how the future would be changed. If you do what you've currently been doing and you're only looking backwards, here's how much worse it could be. And again, we generally only get 1 or 2 shots at this. And for Puerto Rico, this is going to be a critical time frame. For the first time, Puerto Rico is going to have tens of millions to hundreds of millions of dollars to invest in building resiliency. But that's not a lot of money when you look at all the needs within the Commonwealth. And it would be very easy to spread these projects out so much that we don't really build the resiliency we hope to. But having modeling tools on the front end before these decisions are made to show what is possible, how much risk can we buy down, what does the future look like, and are we making the best investments with our finite dollars to make sure that we've hardened the things that are most critical, not just what people perceive as most important. Because sometimes what we think is important, when you actually look at the underlying systems, it turns out things such as roads may be more critical than anything else when it comes to being able to get in and fix things after disaster.
No, I imagine just listening to what you're saying, that as you roll out success stories and as cities start emerging, showcasing the success they had with a storm, with a natural disaster, thanks to their modeling or thanks to that scenario thinking and those strategic investments they made, I don't know, some time ago, when they're hit by the next storm, and they're able to tell the world that if it hadn't been for this sort of modeling, they would have lost X more lives. It would have cost them X much more money, and that'll certainly help again break that mental barrier that we're seeing today, that are just keeping city and other authorities from adopting modeling.
Yeah, the challenge is if we have to wait until we've had actual events to validate the models, fortunately they're infrequent and it's too slow of a process. So we're having to go in and, well, a lot of times we'll do to show people what we're capable of. We'll do hindcasting. We'll take an event that they had and we'll just plug it into our models and see how the models actually reflected the actual event. And that hopefully gets people to understand what it's capable of doing. And then the other thing that, again, we'd have to wait for disaster to validate it, is using very high resolution modeling. That if we can model the actual events, then we should be able to model how projects change those events. And again, we're able to look at so much information so fast using our systems that we can build very elaborate scenarios to do the what ifs and do it much quicker than our current systems, to allow you more flexibility to say, well, let's change this and see what happens, or let's change that and see what happens. But again, if we wait for the disasters to validate, then it's too slow and we're behind. We don't have that luxury. If we're not looking at, particularly stuff we're rebuilding or building today against the future, we're only looking to the past, then we have ensured that it will fail in that disaster when it happens.
Okay, well, let that be the last word. Thank you so much for joining us and being available for the interview, and good luck with One Concern and all your future endeavors. And if you're ever back in Puerto Rico, let us know so we can go around the island together perhaps and do another story on how not just Puerto Rico but other places can indeed invest strategically and with the modeling and the scenario thinking to have a better outcome next time than certainly we saw here, where the island is still reeling from the effects of Maria. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.